It was a Thursday night. My parents were gone to visit my grandma, so I was home alone for the whole weekend. My name's Eric. I was 19. And the idea of having the house to myself meant a weekend of video games and late-night movies without anyone telling me otherwise. Our house was pretty big, with lots of rooms, but it was the basement that always gave me the creeps. It was old, and we hardly ever used it. That night, after binge-watching my favorite show, I heard a thud. It was coming from the basement, a sound like something or someone dragging across the floor. My first thought was that it was just the house settling. So I decided to just ignore it and went back to my show. Yeah, I was watching Gossip Girl. I know what you're thinking, but after being roped into it several times by my sister, I actually started watching the series on my own. Honestly, it's a great way to pass the time, and I've really gotten into it. There I was, completely absorbed in an intense moment where Blair or Chuck was in danger, the kind of scene that makes you forget you're just watching TV. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It sounded like footsteps. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The house was locked, and I hadn't heard any doors or windows break. Still, the thought of checking the basement made my stomach turn. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, telling myself I was just being paranoid. So, I started my walk toward the basement. Standing at the top of the basement stairs, I hesitated. The light from the flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness below. I took a deep breath and started down, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom, I shone the light around the cluttered space, half expecting to find a raccoon or some other animal that had found its way in. But then I saw it. A figure, hunched over in the corner of the basement. My heart raced, and I froze. The flashlight's beam fixed on the figure. It turned around, and for a moment we just stared at each other. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, his eyes wide with surprise. I didn't know what to do. Should I yell or run? Before I could decide, the man took a step toward me. Instinctively, I ran up the stairs. I was nearly at the top when I heard the sound of someone behind me, shoving aside boxes and furniture in a frantic pursuit. Thankfully, I was almost out. I reached the door, and as I swung it closed behind me, I caught a glimpse of the man. His eyes were wide, his gaze desperate, fixed on me as if I was his lifeline. I slammed the door shut with all my might and twisted the lock into place. The man didn't miss a beat. He began to pound on the door with one hand while the other twisted the doorknob back and trying hard but failing to open it. The sounds of his desperation, the relentless pounding and the rattling doorknob echoed through the house. For some weird reason, I started to feel sorry for the man. Trapped, with no other way out, the man's actions grew more aggressive and desperate. I backed away and dialed 911. During the chaos, his voice broke through. "Please, let me out. I mean no harm." His plea hung in the air, a stark contrast to the ordeal he had put me through. Yet there was a tone in his voice that made me pause, a hint of genuine fear, maybe even regret. But the danger of the situation was too real, the risk too high to trust the sincerity of his words. This kept going on for a few minutes. Then, suddenly, the man stopped banging on the door. I heard him let out a big sigh and then the sound of his footsteps as he walked back down the stairs. A little while later, everything went quiet. I felt so relieved. When the police got there, they found the man still in the basement, now quietly hiding among the old furniture and boxes. He was homeless and had been using our basement as a shelter for the past few weeks. It turned out that this was the only way he could enter our home, through a small window we rarely checked and always left unlocked by mistake. He had made sure it stayed that way so he could come and go as he pleased, turning a forgotten corner of our house into his makeshift home. The police discovered his few possessions tucked away in a corner, alongside evidence of his living conditions. It was a wake-up call for us about the importance of security and paying attention to all parts of our home, even those we seldom use. The man had nowhere else to go, and in his desperation, he had chosen our basement as a refuge. Despite the initial fear and shock of the encounter, I couldn't help but feel a bit of sympathy for him. The situation was resolved peacefully, with the police helping him find a place where he could get the assistance he needed. That night changed the way I viewed my home and my sense of security. It was a reminder that not all intruders come with ill intentions. Some are just looking for a place to escape their own harsh realities. Nonetheless, it reinforced the need to be vigilant about our safety and to make sure that every part of our home is secure. It was a typical Friday evening in the small town where I lived, nestled between thick forests and winding roads. My parents had gone out for the weekend, leaving me, Lena, at 22, alone in our cozy if somewhat isolated home. I had planned a quiet night in, with a stack of movies and enough snacks to last me through the night. The house, an old Victorian passed down through generations, had its quirks, creaking and settling more than a house its age should. I was used to its sounds, or so I thought. The evening began uneventfully, with me curled up on the sofa, the glow of the TV casting shadows across the room. I was halfway through the first movie when I heard it, a soft thud. I paused the movie, listening intently. The house was silent. I chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps a neighborhood cat making its rounds. But then, as the night deepened, the silence was broken again, this time by a series of faint but unmistakable footsteps. They seemed to come from the hallway upstairs, slow and measured. I froze. It's just the house, I told myself. Yet, the footsteps continued, each step echoing in the otherwise silent home. Curiosity overcame fear. I muted the TV, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped. Silence enveloped the house once more, so thick it felt like a presence itself. I grabbed my phone, using it as a makeshift flashlight, and tiptoed toward the staircase, my every step seeming impossibly loud. As I reached the foot of the stairs, I called out, "Mom? Dad? Are you guys home?" hoping to hear my parents' voices in response, revealing this to be a surprise return. But there was no answer, only the sound of my own breathing. For some stupid reason, I can't remember why I decided to check it by myself instead of calling the police. I walked the stairs. The sound of what I thought were footsteps earlier had led to the spare room. I pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly. I looked around and saw that the room was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned to leave, that's when I saw it. A shadow zipped across the wall opposite the room's window. It moved so fast and didn't match anything around. My brain tried to make sense of it, thinking maybe it was just the way the light played in the room, but deep down I was scared. Just as I was trying to convince myself I was seeing things, the whole house suddenly felt like it jumped. Downstairs, a door slammed with a loud bang. My phone almost slipped from my hand. That noise wasn't something you'd hear from the house being old. It was clear as day someone or something had just forcefully shut a door inside the house. Panic didn't just set in, it flooded me. Every scary story I'd ever heard about being home alone flashed through my mind. I didn't think twice. I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. But then it got worse. I could hear footsteps entering the house. They moved from one room to another downstairs, and then I heard them start to come up the stairs. Each step creaked under the weight, getting closer and closer. I grabbed anything I could use to defend myself, holding my phone tight in one hand, ready to call for help. The footsteps kept coming closer. I held my breath, praying to God they'd just go away. But they didn't. They stopped right outside my door. I could almost feel whoever was there knew I was in on the other side, deciding what to do next. It was the longest moment of my life listening to my own heartbeat. Then, they suddenly moved away. The footsteps retreated, but the fear stayed with me, gripping me so damn tight I couldn't move or think. I never felt more alone and vulnerable than I did in those moments, listening to the silence that followed, wondering if this nightmare was really over or if it was just beginning. I dialed 911, whispering my situation and address. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline in the darkness. "Stay on the line," she instructed. "Help is on the way." I waited while the footsteps continued their march. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped again. Silence once again. The sound of sirens in the distance had never been so welcome. I heard shouting, the unmistakable command of police, and then the sound of someone being taken from the house, the figure, the intruder, who had shattered the sanctity of my home. The police later told me the man was a known burglar, caught in the act thanks to my call. The relief was palpable, but so was the realization of what could have happened. The house no longer felt safe. It was a reminder of my vulnerability. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to my intuition, and I realized that sometimes the true horror isn't in the unknown lurking outside. But I also learned about courage, the kind that lives within us, quiet and unassuming, waiting for the moment we need it most. I'm Max, a 15-year-old who pretty much lives a normal life. I go to school, hang out with friends, and play video games. Nothing too exciting. One weekend, my parents decided to visit my grandma, leaving me home alone for the first time. They trusted me enough to stay by myself, and I was pumped about having the house all to myself. At first, I was all excited, planning to play video games all night. But then, as the evening came, I started feeling a bit uneasy about being alone. I called my big brother who's at college to tell him about feeling a bit weird. He laughed and said, "You'll be fine, dude. Just lock the doors and enjoy your freedom. Call me if you need anything." Feeling a bit better after talking to my brother, I locked all the doors, grabbed some snacks, and started my video game marathon. Around midnight, while I was deep into my game, I heard a strange noise coming from the backyard. It wasn't like any sound I'd heard before. My first thought was, it's just a cat or something, but it kept bothering me. I paused my game and decided to check it out. I turned on the backyard light and peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anything. The noise stopped. With too many scary stories in mind, I knew better than to step outside. I looked, expecting to see an animal or something making the noise, but there was nothing, just my own thoughts. I figured I was just being paranoid, so I turned off the backyard light and walked to the living room. Back to my game, the sense of unease hadn't left me. I was online chatting with some friends, telling them what just happened. As you can guess, telling these stories to teenage friends is not comforting. They just made jokes, saying the butcher is coming for me. I joined their laughs, pretending I wasn't scared. But in reality, I was freaking out. This went on for about 10 minutes when a chill ran through my whole body. The weird noise was happening again, but this time it wasn't just any noise. It was closer, as if it was right inside the house, coming from the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest flashlight, my hands a bit shaky, and tiptoed towards the kitchen to check. Reaching the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was the back door slightly ajar, letting in a cool night breeze that I hadn't felt earlier. My mind raced with questions. Had I forgotten to lock it? Without wasting a second, I pushed it shut and locked it. I scanned the kitchen, expecting to find someone hiding, but it was empty. The idea that someone might have been trying to sneak in sent a chill down my spine. Back then, I thought maybe I just forgot to lock it earlier and tried to ignore the scary feeling. Looking back now, that was really dumb of me. How could I have been so careless? But I guess as a kid, you want to handle things on your own and not bother your parents with something that seems so small. Anyway, with the door now locked, I headed back to the living room. That feeling that something was off kept lingering. I made a round of the house, double-checking every door and window to make sure they were securely locked, telling myself it was just to be safe. But as I settled back into my game, trying to lose myself in the virtual world, a new sound pierced the silence of the night. Soft, uneven breaths. It was so quiet at first that I thought I imagined it. But then, it was unmistakable. My stomach flipped, and without thinking, I turned around. There, on the couch, was a man. He looked normal, except for his strange haircut, like nothing I'd ever seen. Our eyes met, and he asked, "Do you know where I can find Mrs. Snuffles?" His voice was calm, but it froze me in place. Then in a split second, adrenaline kicked in. I made a move toward the exit. I couldn't scream or say anything. My voice seemed stuck in my throat. I bolted straight to the front door, yanked it open, and dashed outside. I just ran, not knowing if the man was following me, but I didn't care. I wanted to be safe. Outside, I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house, pounding on their door like a madman until they answered. I blurted out what happened, my words tumbling over each other. They called the police, and within minutes, the neighborhood was filled with the flashing lights of police cars. The police searched my house, but found no one. Mrs. Snuffles, it turned out, was a name my neighbor mentioned once about a cat that vanished after one of the neighborhood kids disappeared around 5 years ago. The case was closed 2 years ago, but after hearing my story, the police wanted to know everything about the man, his looks, everything. My mother had to step in because the police were too direct, asking too many questions, which made me feel really uneasy after the horrifying experience. Days later, we went back to the police station for an interview. They didn't tell me the details, but only that my information helped them reopen the case. Till this day, I don't know if they caught him. After that night, my view on being home alone changed. My parents and I reviewed safety measures, and we even got a security system installed. The experience was terrifying. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't noticed the man kept lingering in my mind. Would I have disappeared too, like the other kid? Luckily, I never have to find out, and after some therapy, I got back to my usual routine.